I'm going to talk about international adoptions. I'm a pediatrician. I've been a doctor for about 40 years, pediatrician for most of those. And for 30 years, I've been involved in intercountry adoptions since I came back to Malta. At the beginning, I knew very little about intercountry adoptions. And I presume if I had a show of hands, probably very few of you here, unless you've been directly involved and you've adopted a child yourself, will know very much about this. It is a long road. There are big rewards at the end, but my God, it's a long tunnel and it's really mind heavily. And I'm going to talk you through this, we'll walk through this tunnel together. Let's go back. History. In the 6th century AD, the Romans actually practiced adoptions. They did adoptions, but they only did it in boys and they only did it in the nobility. And there was nothing altruistic about it. What they were doing is there's a rich family with estates or whatever, and they didn't have an heir. They needed an heir. The girls didn't count. So they basically adopted somebody else's child to take on the estate, and it was all about power. Post the Second World War and the Vietnam War and the Cambodian War, there were loads of orphans to be had. And suddenly there was a big interest in international adoptions, particularly from the States, but also UK and part of Europe. The trouble is, it wasn't regulated, it was chaos. So eventually, a group of countries got together and said, this is wrong, we got to sort this out. And in 1993, there was the Hague Convention on Intercountry Adoptions. The primary aim was let's standardize this, let's get a protocol. And that's what they did. Why do people adopt? Most are couples, most are a bit older because maybe they've been married for a while and they've not had children, and maybe they've gone through a lot of infertility cycles and they want a family. And this option is works for them. It doesn't work for everybody. What about from the children's side? Well, from the children's side, it's a win-win almost always. And I'm going to explain and enlarge on this in a minute. But for the kids being left in a destitute institute for the rest of your life with very poor prospects, it's not great. So for them, adoptions are good. Let's come back to Malta. So the interest in adoptions started off around the 1980s, mid 80s to early 90s, and there was a boom. The only thing, the only source, significant source of child adoptions was from Romania. And this is in the post-Ceausescu era. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of kids in these massive orphanages in terrible conditions, and they were up for grabs. And they were selling them like hotcakes. But there was no regulation and absolute chaos. And in the context of all that, Malta was a signatory to the Hague Convention, so we then started to develop our own national inter-country protocol to regulate this. So we started off pre the protocol with the Romania story with horror stories, and I'm going to give you some horror stories in a minute. And then post having our national protocol, we then moved to Russia. Most of the babies then came from Russia, most of the children. At this point, the EU had stopped all adoptions from Romania because it's essentially child slavery and child trafficking. So then most children in the early millennium came from Russia and some from Pakistan, and then from Russia and Ethiopia and then Cambodia. But by 2013, 2016, all of these countries stopped or were stopped either by the EU and authoritative bodies or by their own governments and their own agencies. And so there was a hiatus and no children were coming at all for about 2 or 3 years until 2018 when India came in. And India now is the only significant country that is providing children for adoption. And I'll come to the problems that we have now in a minute. So how many kids are we talking about? There are only about 10 to 20 children put up for adoption from Malta, indigenous. And the rest, and it's a factor of four or thereabouts, 4 times as much, come from abroad. So most children adopted in this country are from abroad and are not Maltese. Before the 1990s, there was no process, and it was Romania that were providing the source of these children. And as I said, these were children in these destitute, big orphanages, very poor nutritional conditions, and they became anemic. So they should have given them a proper diet and given them some iron or some supplements. But what they did is they gave them blood transfusions from unscreened donors who had hepatitis B. And about 25% of children coming from this cohort were hepatitis B positive. Now, if you put it in the context, we are in the 90s. No, we didn't have a national protocol at the time. So Maltese couples who were thinking of adopting would make the contacts, go up to Romania, and get shown a child who outwardly looks fine, sign on the dotted line, come back to Malta, and we confirm hepatitis B. And some of these families will be totally ostracized by the family. They would speak to them. We had others, two children, for example, brother and sister, boy is negative, the older daughter, the sister is positive. She's refused school entry. We had a major fight on that one, I have to say. I don't have time to go into that. But you had these problems. You had Maltese couples going up, and we're told, hang on a minute, yeah, they first give you the documents and then the photographs. So they're basically casting a reel, and they're reeling you in. You're caught. You're like the worm on the hook. And then when you get there, they'll show you the child. So now you're really bonding. But they tell you, hang on a minute, we have a problem because Mr. and Mrs. Rossi from Padua are also interested in young whoever. Ah, but look, and Mr. and Mrs. Rossi do the same, and usually the Maltese couple got gazumped. It was an auction. Literally, it was an auction. But then they say, and the Maltese couple get gazumped, they lose the child, but they told, hang on a minute, come back in 2 days and we'll sort you out. So a process that has taken 2 years, because it would be about 2 years to get to this stage. Now suddenly in 2 days, we have a solution. And they go in 2 days' time, there is another child. Of course, this child is hepatitis B positive, but they're not told that. Well, they don't even understand that. They've had no instruction, no guidance, no nothing before they went. So, with that background, we set up this protocol because one of the main reasons to cut this out and sort it out. And the protocol not only addressed what children are coming and vetting them and giving the parents advice on what to expect and what the conditions may be, etc. But also there were regulations to the parents. So there was a home study report which had to be carried out, which assessed the home, the income, the environment, all of that stuff. There was a suitability assessment of the potential parents to make sure they're not crackpots and they are okay to adopt. Yeah, they had to be, at least one of the couple had to be 28 years old. The oldest one could not be more than the age gap between the parent and the child could not be more than 45 years old. But that still meant you could have early 60-year-old couple adopting a 15-year-old girl. And we'll come back to that in a minute. The initial protocol dictated you had to be married. And then in 2013, they accepted single parent adoptions, but you still had gay parents who would adopt because when they had the home study report, they would hide the second bag and the second shoes and whatever. And so it looks like you're a single parent, and they got through the back door, if you like. But it meant that the second parent had no legal rights on that child. So there's a problem. By 2016, we accepted gay adoptions or gay couples adopting children. And at that point, Russia jumped off the ship because they would not allow any country who is practicing gay adoptions to take any of their children. It's a homophobic country, unfortunately. So that was one of the reasons where Russia stopped. What about the exclusions or the criteria for the children? The only criterion for the children was that they had to be hepatitis B, hepatitis C, and HIV negative. Anything else was fine. So you could adopt somebody who's major medical conditions so long as they're not got one of these infections. And that was a public health issue, which you could argue is not fair. It's discriminatory. And if I'm totally altruistic and I want to adopt somebody with HIV, why not? Except I can't. Even today, I can't because they will not issue a visa for that child. Now, if Malta wanted to be really, I don't know, avant garde and a leader and say, okay, we'll be the first country to drop that clause in our inter-country adoption protocol. All other countries have it, by the way. If Malta dropped it, every single referral we get from today onwards will be a child with hepatitis B, hepatitis C, or HIV, because there are loads of these children in orphanages and institutes where they can't go anywhere because nobody will take them. And then we would discriminate against the potential Maltese couples because they will only be given this cohort of child. So you go around in a big circle. So, but did the protocol make a difference? It made a big difference. First of all, it excluded any more of the infectious diseases that we were getting before, and it gave the parents knowledge. At least they could go up. We would vet the referrals beforehand. We would ask more questions. We would tell the parents what the conditions are and what to expect. So at least they were, knowledge is armed. What sort of problems did we have? As I said, infections from Romania, from Russia, most of the problems or most of the children came from prostitutes and drug addicts and people with an alcohol problem. So a lot of the children had fetal alcohol syndrome and conditions relating to drug abuse. Malnutrition, thalassemia, it's a blood problem. That was common in Cambodia. Prematurity, neurodevelopmental problems is very common from India. And at the moment, the majority of the referrals we're getting from India do have a lot of, and in some cases, very significant neurodevelopmental issues. And that is a problem. But at least it's being flagged up before, and there is an option of discussing this and then deciding if you want to move on or not. Ethiopia, we would get pictures, but you just see the eyes and the nose, and that's it. And everything else is swaddled in lots and lots of sheets. And the reason was that the babies from Ethiopia were coming from a convent, an orphanage run by Maltese nuns. And they dared not send unclothed pictures of babies for fear of repercussions in the country where they were partly persecuted anyway. There was a lot of coercion. So parents would be told, you potential parents, you must make a decision by tomorrow. When we by tomorrow, it's taken forever to get to this stage. And this is the biggest life changing event that we are going to make as a couple. And you want me to decide by tomorrow. My advice was always, if they put a gun to your head, walk away. They can't be trusted. What about bribes? All those who went up to Russia were told, take at least 5,000 euro petty cash, petty in small quotes, and came back with no change because you have to give the law clerk, the court clerk, and the magistrate and whatever to hear your case. Otherwise, your case stayed on the shelf. Criminality, we actually had outright criminality. There was one example: parents, documents, results. First time I'm seeing them, and I'm looking through. I said, "You sure I haven't seen it before?" "No." "You sure?" "No." "But look at this result. It was actually a hepatitis B result." And when I see a result, I squiggle SAM, Dr. Sam. Yeah. And there was my squiggle SAM on this form. I said, "But that's my signature." He said, "It can't be. This is the first time we're seeing you." Anyway, what was happening was the agency and the institute were in cahoots. They had got hold of a previous result which I had signed and recycled it, changed the name, changed the date of birth, changed the address, and kept the letterhead and kept the result negative. It was a negative result. That agency was closed. A couple of people went to prison because we reported them, basically. I alluded to the age gap, that you can have quite old parents adopting teenagers because of the conditions allowed it. But we've had cases where you're looking at these people my age, okay, early 60s, and they've got a 14, 15-year-old girl who's not even an orphan, who's been taken away from her family in Bangladesh. And you think, what's going on here? Why are the parents, why is the family giving this child up? Who's very happy with no problems in Bangladesh. And it's a money thing. And they're basically doing it so they can have a carer for the old age and not be put into a home. How many children with this protocol are rejected? Because we see the reports and we see, and as I said, they're almost all now from India. We see lots of serious neurodevelopmental problems. And the parents, usually, when they initially apply, they're asked, would you take a child with no normal, minor disability, major disability? They all tick the box minor. We tell them to tick the box minor. If you tick normal, you get nothing, because most countries have this policy where if they're normal, they have to be adopted in-house and not sent abroad. And if they pay major, they will be given really seriously major problems. So they tick minor, but from India at the moment, we're getting a lot of problems. And so the agencies, when we write our report, in 75% of the cases, do not even forward them to potential adoptive parents because the problems are too big. So there is a problem. We only have one country referral, and the referrals are problematic, and few are passed on to the parents. But that's the way it is at the moment. What about problems of those who have come and have been adopted? Well, the infections is a time of the past that was in the pre-protocol time. So we don't see that. But we do see a lot of problems with speech delay, particularly learning problems, schooling problems, and more than we would see in the general population, but in most cases, not something that cannot be managed. Behavioral problems, autism, again, more than in the general population, but not, it's not that common. It's not like every child who's been adopted from another country has got these problems. The vast majority are fine. So just put it all into perspective. We've had some seriously medical problems, which we knew about because the protocol picked it up. And we've had, for example, children with major cardiac problems who we knew had what they had. And the moment they landed, we turned the plane round and sent them up to London for major cardiac surgery and then come back to Malta as Maltese citizens covered by the Malta UK protocol. Has it failed? Or have we failed? And the answer is yes, of course. There's been about 1,000 adoptions now in this 30-year period that I'm talking about. And there have been some cases where the children have arrived and they've fallen out with the parents. They just didn't bond. It just didn't work out. But they're less than half a dozen. So it's a really small number out of the whole total. And a very few of those have had the ultimate failure where they've gone back into care. So they've come from another country, it doesn't work out, and they've gone into care in Malta. And that's really the ultimate failure. But I'm pleased to say that is by far the minority. Because the majority, and if you ask the parents, would you do it again, even though you've gone through this minefield and this really dark tunnel? And the answer is yes. Would you pay the same amount? Yes. So it was 10,000, 12,000 lira Maltine in the 90s. It's about 26,000 now, although you can get a grant from the government. But they'll say yes because they have a family, they have what they want, and you see them, and it works. And it works even if you have same gender, single parent families. My pendulum has moved. I was skeptical maybe initially about the same gender. My pendulum is all the way. I have a lot of same gender parents who have adopted children, and they're absolutely fine. And what about the children? At the end of the day, yes, it's about the parents and the family, but what about the children? And for them, it is almost always a win-win. And on that cheery note, I'll stop.